Director, Mr. Chairman, Your Excellency the Governor, and friends. Thank you for that stunning introduction. May I point out that every year is the year of the woman. And also that for 8 years in the last decade, we were very lucky in that those were the years of Ronald Reagan, who did such great things for the cause in which we believe. His message, as always, was marvelous. He's a real pro when it comes to delivering these superb pieces of philosophy and belief and inspiring us all. Now, today, as it has been pointed out to me, is Constitution Day. It is the birthday of the American Constitution. And it has been suggested to me that I say 3 things to you this evening at this truly wonderful center to which I am so delighted to be invited. First, some reflections on the Constitution and its relevance to modern times. Second, the way in which Ronald Reagan and I worked together to achieve rather a lot of things. And thirdly, a walk around the world. If I can complete that agenda, I will do so. But I am a devoted admirer, first, of the American Constitution, and am particularly fortunate to have been given one of the bicentennial keepsake editions, actually signed by all members of the Supreme Court. I regard it as a particularly valuable document, valuable in itself, and valuable because of those signatures. It was given to me by Sandra Day O'Connor when the American bar and judges were on a visit to Britain, and we were, of course, comparing our great heritage of the legal system and the great heritage of justice. This, as Winston Churchill always said, is the greatest expression of liberty in the English language. And it is absolutely marvelous, both for the principles for which it stands and the way in which they are drafted. What always struck me reading it was how very different it was, although the results were the same, from the great charter, the great Magna Carta, which is your heritage as much as mine, when the barons in the 13th century lined up to the king and said, now look, we're not going to support you unless you ensure that our old Anglo-Saxon traditions, particularly of justice, can and do prevail. The king was wise enough at that time to say, yes, of course they could. And so, in theory, that was the king granting powers to the then electorate. Mind you, he had little choice at the time. But that was the doctrine. The theory was the king was granting powers to the electorate. Not so the American Constitution, which starts, the only constitution in the world which starts, we the people. The American Constitution is the people granting powers to the government for a limited period of time. It is the only constitution in the world which does that and makes it absolutely clear that the task of government is not to dominate, but it is to serve the people of the country. It is quite a remarkable beginning to a constitution. Jefferson, who, as you know, wrote it, was a genius with the written word. He was a genius in many ways, a very unhappy life he had, but he was a genius with the written word. And when he came to draft this constitution, he believed very much that we should have regard to history. He was a passionate believer in that young people, and perhaps older ones as well, should be taught the history of the past, should be taught it, as he said, because, as he said, By apprising them of the past, it will enable them to judge the future. It will avail them of the experience of other times and other nations. It will qualify them as judges of the actions and designs of men. It was also Edmund Burke who said, if you do not learn from the mistakes of history, you will be condemned to repeat them. Both men, great philosophers, great writers, had precisely the same idea. And yet it was interesting, he never recommended that new generations follow that constitution or the history slavishly. But as far as the history was concerned, that it served to keep all the actions of the future in perspective and to keep the main principles before future generations. May I give my version of what is very important for us today in that constitution? Important when we remember that the whole rival political system, rival to the free society, ours is the free society, the rival political system never paid much attention, or indeed any, to the dignity or rights of the individual. The rival political system, enunciated by Marx and Lenin, took away all the freedoms of the individual and said, in future, you will obey the diktat of a few people at the top who will plan everything. They not only took away all liberties, they took away all property. They not only took away all property, they took away all jobs, so that a people became totally and utterly dependent on the government, the very opposite of your own constitution. People, the individuals, their sanctity didn't matter. Of course their sanctity didn't matter. They were denied freedom of worship. There was in the Communist Creed nothing to worship except the government. And so you have the two extremes. And it's always very ironic sometimes when some of the left criticize the system in which we believe and say it's materialistic, it's profit motive, and so on. Let me tell you how I see it, which I believe is the correct way. Of course I would. But the thing is this: freedom is a moral quality. It's not just a civic quality, it's not just a national quality, it is a moral quality. It is the quality which enables us to exercise our God-given talents and abilities. That is a right which no government should ever be able to take away. It matters, and our contribution matters, because with nearly 6 billion people in the world now, each and every one is unique. No two are alike, a miracle in itself. And therefore everyone has some contribution to make. And the task of government is to see that you have a framework of law within which they can make that contribution and develop their talents and abilities. And so you get the second principle, that there's no such freedom, there's no freedom without a rule of law. Otherwise it would be sometimes freedom of the strong to oppress the weak. And so the rule of law is the other great principle of a free society. And a rule of law does not mean merely the diktat of government of the day, but the law passed by the elected representatives of the people, and that is the principle of consent. And so we have the freedom and the justice, and you cannot have, therefore, freedom except in a civil society which honors a rule of law. Please don't think that this sounds rather like a philosophical lecture. I have very much in mind as I'm saying it, that we take all of these things for granted. But when I first visited Russia, or the Soviet Union as it then was, and the East European countries, one of the first things you notice is they do not have a rule of justice. They have only the diktat of the Communist Party. There is no place they can go to get justice. And we have all of these things, and we take them totally for granted. But it also has an economic effect as well. Because nations are rich, not according to their natural resources only. If that were so, then the two richest countries in the world now would be Russia. Russia alone, the biggest country in the former Soviet Union, has the biggest natural resources in the whole world, and also Brazil. They are not the richest countries. How come? How come? Because their systems of government have snuffed out the essential enterprise, indeed have snuffed out the most valuable resource of all, which of course is the human resource. And until the ingenuity of man can in fact see a use for those materials and find out a way to use them and put them to advantage, until that time, you will not in fact find them turned to use and to raise the quality of life. And so what this is all about is the creative capacity of man, which is a noble quality, it should be respected, encouraged, and used. And I was very, very interested, I might tell you, I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I was very, very interested in the Pope's encyclical, which I think for the first time recognized the system of enterprise, recognized its morality, recognized the need to invest, recognized the need for man's creative ability, recognized how much it acted by getting people together in order to produce, and therefore had a sense of community, recognizing that it produced things that people wanted and also had a sense of community. And this is what he said. In short, besides the earth, man's principal resource is man himself. His intelligence enables him to discover the earth's productive potential and the many different ways in which human needs can be satisfied. Perhaps we in business have been too slow to point out that capitalism is therefore not only about material things, it is about the human spirit and its creativity. Now that is the moral case for capitalism that is now at last being put much more cogently in schools like this and in people like Michael Novak. The moral case. It is the only way in which man's talent and ability can be used. It is the only way which creates the wealth. And in creating the wealth, that is not materialistic of itself. On the contrary, most of us want to give young people a better chance and a better quality of life than we had, and it can't be done, and you can't build universities like this without doing it. And I always remember, if I might quote the other end of the Christian church, which was of course John Wesley. I was brought up as a Methodist, who said, do not criticize money, do not impute to money the faults of some of them that use it. In other words, if you use it well, then there you are. Now that is, as I take it, part of the great morality of capitalism, the morality of freedom under a rule of law. And there's only just one further point that I would like to say on this matter. It's not only the principle of freedom and its use, it's not only the rule of law. What makes a man, a family, or a community, or a nation is the values by which they live. For values not only inspire policies, they inspire people. And so all the best of the values which mean so much to us, the ones which we try to apply in daily life, the hard work, the looking after one's family, the obligation to one's neighbor, it is not only the minimum which you have to do by law, it is what you do in addition to that as a matter of the social and moral authority of the nation, which gives you the very high standard of living of this society. And I will usually say, when I'm speaking to audiences in the previous Soviet Union or elsewhere, the most generous society in the world is one which was founded by the Christian settlers who knew full well that they had an obligation to others, and ever since then they've been fulfilling that obligation. I hope it is clear to you that I believe in your Constitution and believe that not only what is written there, but what we must apply in daily life, the standards and values which are the foundation of democracy. Otherwise, democracy itself will disintegrate and decay. Now, perhaps that is enough for the birthday of the Constitution. There's one other moral point I would like to put to you. And this one was enunciated by Winston Churchill. That Constitution we've been talking about is the Constitution of liberty. It is very much like our unwritten Constitution. Now, what about foreign affairs? For years, people said foreign affairs should be run according to the interests of the nation. I always thought it a rather clinical phrase, much used by diplomats, but then I was never a diplomat or very diplomatic. But just at a time of very great difficulty this century, Winston Churchill came out with a very, very different belief. It was in 1938. They were years of tyranny. We didn't know the full extent of the tyranny. It was the year of Munich. Within 18 months, we were to be at war. And this is what Winston said. And this is what I believe has informed our policy for the greater part of the time since, and yours too. There must be a moral basis for foreign policy. If all our energies are to be concentrated on the essential task of increasing our strength and security, it can only be because of lofty and unselfish ideals which stir the pulses of the English-speaking race in every quarter of the globe. My friends, that is why a large part of the globe has been released from tyranny to enjoy freedom once again, because of lofty and unselfish ideals, and because it was those which were the basis of our foreign policy in the greatest alliance for liberty the world's ever known, which is the American-Anglo alliance. And so on both sides, there is a great morality to the political creed which we espouse. Now, may I come on to the second subject which you have given me to speak to. I'm always delighted to speak about President Reagan. There were only 3 prime ministers who were actually in office for the whole time of an American president, and I was one. I got there just before President Reagan. I was as prime minister during the whole of his time, and I stayed on a couple of years longer. So we had a rather interesting partnership. Not on the partnership, we were actually tackling a similar sort of problem. We both came to power in our respective countries, believing the same things, but we both saw, each of us, a nation not living up to the best of the talent that was within it. America was rather demoralized. You had the terrible incidents of the hostages in Iran, and America wasn't living up to the best. Her morale had gone, and in Britain we'd had the winter of discontent, we'd had strikes. So we both faced, how are we to take this country from pessimism to pride? How are we to get back the enterprise going? How are we to get it dynamic, enthusiastic, serving both its own purposes and serving the world as well? Ronald Reagan and I both followed to some extent similar policies. Take away so many of the regulations, cut the taxes, have a framework for enterprise, raise the spirits and hope of the people by reference to the great things they have done in the past, so they will do great things in the future. In Britain, we had to do even more than that. We were even more regulated and had to take the regulations down. We were even more taxed and had to take the taxation down. We had a vast trade union law which was causing strikes all over the place, and we had to alter the powers of the trade unions in relation to the employers, and we had to alter the relationship between the trade union officials and their members. We did it all, and we had also to privatize many, many nationalized industries, because the state has no business to be in business. It doesn't know how to run it. Now, in both countries, the morale of the people rose. We created wealth, and business created the jobs. The number of people in employment went up enormously. And in my country, the number of strikes went down. But it's interesting now that taxation is back right in the news. Let me tell you what we both found when we took down the top rates of taxation. In Britain, when I came in, the top rate of taxation was rather higher than it was in America, 83% on earnings and 98% on savings, ridiculous. We took it down immediately to 60% and picked it up on indirect tax, and then took it down to 40%. The interesting thing was this: as we took the top rate of tax down on the top 5% of incomes, the proportion of tax contributed to the whole revenue by that top 5% rose considerably, from something like 23% to 28%. Everyone needs incentive, and the most creative people we need most of all, so that they may, in fact, create both the wealth and the jobs. I thought that might be interesting to one or two people today. Now, let's have a look at the overseas. Let's have a look at the overseas policy, because it was really here that enormous strides were made, which I think were largely responsible for what happened when communism collapsed. Until Ronald Reagan and I both came in, the whole theory and doctrine of foreign policy with regard to communism had been one of containment for quite a long time. Here's this great monolithic system. It has an objective of world communism, which it pursues either by military might or by subversion. We all had it. Or in fact by having a military government as in Poland, or in fact by proxy as with the Cubans in Angola. But here it is. It wants communism everywhere. We can't stop it doing these things, but perhaps we can contain it. Now, that wasn't good enough for Ronald Reagan and I. We believed in liberty. Communism was the negation of liberty. There were many, many people, and by that time we knew the terrible things that Stalin had done, the terrible murders, the terrible massacres, the terrible gulags. No, we weren't going to do the containment. We were going to do what we call, well, two things. First, we were going to increase our defenses and get ahead in the latest technology, so that we could say to the communist world, you will never gain your way by military might, because whatever you do, you will have something better, and will have the latest technology, and will have the better quality. So you can drop that ambition. And we both did it. And even at a time of restraint and cutting public expenditure, I reordered our priorities so that we put more into defense and also more into law and order within the country. That eventually worked. And then the other thing we said is we're going to put freedom on the offensive. That didn't mean a military offensive. It meant talking about it. It meant talking about human rights. It meant tackling the communist countries on human rights. And that we did every single time we met them. Why don't you let your people out? We don't have people can leave our country at any time they wish. Our problem is to stop too many people coming in. Why don't you let them go? And we tackled them again and again and again. I also did something else. I thought there must soon be a different generation of politicians in the Soviet Union. All the old boys weren't going to last forever, and I thought we should look for some younger ones. And I got the Foreign Office to give me a little list. And I looked down it and said, look, there's one called Gorbachev there, try him. And he came over to see me at Chequers, and you know the rest. He was a totally different caliber and kind of person from any other I had ever met in the Soviet Union, and I had met a lot. This was the first one who was prepared to debate and discuss freely and easily. It was the first person who was prepared to admit that there were things wrong with the Soviet Union. In particular, that they had quite a good yield of agriculture, but 30% of the product never got to the market. Why? Well, it disappeared on the railways, or the railways weren't good, or the lorries weren't there, or they hadn't in fact got storage facilities in the country. Why hadn't they? I said, oh, well, Lenin decreed that there should be in the towns. I said, that was nearly 70 years ago. Hasn't it been changed? All of this we went through. And at the end, I've said to the press, this is a man I can do business with. Now, very shortly he became, as you know, the Secretary General in the Soviet Union. Now, the way in which he tackled the ending of communism was quite different from the way in which Deng Xiaoping in China has tackled it. He looked around at what he saw in the free society. He saw the tremendous plenty that it produced, saw the shops were full of goods. And he decided that the best thing he could do was to give the people back what they should never have lost: their freedom of speech, their freedom of worship, their freedom of association, their freedom of discussion, their freedom to form different political parties, and the right to vote for their representatives in the Supreme Soviet and the Congress of the People. That was the most colossal advance. You would never have thought of that. And the atmosphere was changed immediately. I think he felt that by discussion he would find the way forward to getting a prosperous society. And I noticed the speeches he made started to be totally different. He said, look, the communist cadres must in fact in future exercise some initiative. Now that was a great shock. They'd never been allowed to. They'd been punished if they did. Exercise some initiative and take some responsibility. But the fact was, they hadn't got the institutions of liberty. They hadn't got a proper central bank. They hadn't got the statistics to know. They didn't even know what they were producing, let alone how it related to the money they were printing. They had no rule of contract, no commercial law, no independent courts of justice, and no tradition of enterprise in the memory of anyone living. But the people, having been given freedom, as I talked to them, they said, we're waiting for them to give us economic prosperity now. There was no understanding of how it could come about. He had not dispersed power very much. And by the time of the attempted coup, he was about to disperse it and change things. And then not only did the coup fail, but the total unexpected thing happened. The Soviet Union fell apart. None of us had ever thought that would happen. And instead of 3 votes in United Nations, because Stalin had always insisted on 3 for the Soviet Union, there then became 15. And the number of nations in the United Nations went up to 184. Now you therefore have still, Mr. Yeltsin got elected as President of Russia. Now when you go to Russia now, as some of you do, and I have been very recently, you will find that they have a basic problem. Although Yeltsin is a real market man, he actually believes in the free market and is trying to privatize as much as he can. He always did, and knew that political liberty wouldn't last unless you got economic liberty. He's got a problem. They're still on the 1978 Brezhnev communist constitution. He's got a new one, but he can't get the new one through the old parliament because there are too many old communists in that. So they've got a kind of crisis of authority until that parliament is dissolved, a new one elected, which will accept the new constitution, a constitution of liberty. But what is happening is quite different outside Moscow from what is happening inside. And it's very interesting as I went outside. There you will have, in some of the provinces, some young governors who, because of the liberty that Gorbachev gave, have had 5 or 6 years of freedom of discussion, and they're not really bothering very much about the old constitution. They are in fact busy selling land to the people who are busy buying it and growing things on it. One area I visited, the governor had sold all of the shops to the people. He'd sold every single small business. He'd started to privatize the whole of the transport system and sold the lorries to the people. And also he had privatized an ex-defense factory and turned it over to civilian production. This was a young man of 32. And there things were going very well. And you will find that happening in quite a number of areas. I then went to a shopping center outside Moscow, on the outskirts. Very, very few things in the shops, but there are not long queues as they used to be. And the people recognized me and gathered around immediately. Now, Mrs. Thatcher, what do you think? What's the difference between Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Yeltsin? Now tell us honestly. They're very articulate, absolutely fascinating. And I simply said to them, look, Mr. Gorbachev gave you personal and political liberty and brought about the collapse of communism. And it would never have happened without him. Mr. Yeltsin is trying to get you the market economy and an era of plenty, but you've got to help him to get a new constitution. Now, these things are happening, and I'm absolutely certain that in Russia it will never go back to the old rigidity. There are problems, of course, with some of the other states because the whole trading system has collapsed, and they still have not yet got a law or a currency that is stable. And when you have a system where the governor of the central bank suddenly cancels a currency when it's more than a few months old without any reference to the finance minister, you know that all is not well. But nevertheless, they will not go back, I am certain, to the old system. They have got used to liberty, and they must will find their way through, and we must help them to do it, help them to build the institutions of liberty. Can I just turn for a moment to China? China is a completely different. It's a country of 1.2 billion people. And I ask you just to consider for a moment what the effect will be in the future in the Pacific when this country breaks through to prosperity, as it will. The world has never known a country of 1.2 billion people prosperous and dominant in a particular area. Now, the whole of the Asia-Pacific, apart from Japan, in spite of the world recession, is growing at a spectacular rate, about 8% per year. In China, the average is between 13 and 14%, and much greater on the coast. It has 1/3, that region has 1/3 of the world's population. It has 1/3 of the world's foreign currency reserves. The trade between countries of that region is about 50 to 60% of the total. And it's growing fast, and within 20 years it will be perhaps the main financial center of the world, or one of the main ones. And we're going from a time when we had two big financial centers, two big industrial commercial centers, America, Europe, and now we're going to have three. America, Europe will be very much lesser than either America or the Asia-Pacific. Now, how's it going to be done in China? I know Deng Xiaoping because I had to negotiate with him over Hong Kong. I knew that his predecessor, Hua Guofeng. I mercifully never knew Mao Zedong. I don't think I would have cared to very much. But I had to negotiate with Deng Xiaoping, and there I met a man who was determined to keep communism in China, but knew that he really had to introduce enterprise if he was to get up the standard of living. And for 10 years, gradually, he's been doing it. First by saying to them, if you produce more than your allotted targets in the factories, whatever extra you can produce, whether on the collectives or the factories, I'll give you a covered market in which to sell it. They took to commerce just like ducks to water. The Chinese are born traders wherever they are in the world. What is more, they had the example of Chinese outside China to see. They could see what they had done in Hong Kong under British administration with a British rule of law, totally non-corrupt. Hong Kong became the third financial center in the world, great production, enormous property values, enormous structure, new airports, new everything. Every bold scheme they could undertake. Go further south. Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan when the communists took over in 1948. Taiwan, the biggest foreign exchange reserves in the world, a very dynamic society, always keeping its budget in surplus and building up the great reserves to which I have referred. You go further south, Singapore, under Harry Lee Kuan Yew, marvelous man, educated in Britain, got a first in law, new British administration, went back and built up Singapore on all the best principles which are second nature to you and me. Another great financial center. So the people in China could see that anyone Chinese had this great talent and ability. They also had the thing that no one has in Russia. Russia has no diaspora in the same way. There aren't Russian places where they have that great prosperity as there are Chinese places. And Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore are investing heavily, very heavily in China and helping along the industrialization of the whole area. Now, it's perfectly obvious what will happen. Historically, in the world as a whole, economic prosperity has preceded political liberty. But it's quite impossible to think that the Chinese will be able to keep political control under communism when you have a prosperous society, when people have become richer, more educated, have traveled more. They will have to have a say in the making of the laws of the country, and that will almost certainly happen. They'll go through difficult times in that period. Now, may I just refer to one more thing in this walk around the world? Because in this last 10 years, there have been years when the unexpected happened. Indeed, there have been years when you and I would have said things could not happen, which have happened. And one of them is the change in the Middle East. Now, there are in politics some problems which are insoluble for a long time. There are all sorts of recurrent problems within the old Soviet Union, where Stalin changed 100 boundaries in the Soviet Union, deliberately putting them across groups of tribes of people and nations of people, and has had many, many problems. But then all of a sudden, circumstances change, and an old problem becomes soluble. In the Middle East, what changed the situation were two things. First, the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. That meant that Arafat and various other groups no longer had the support from Moscow that they had been accustomed to having in pursuing their objective. That was very important. They no longer had the training, the weapon, or anything. Second, the Gulf War. Arafat was on the wrong side, supported Saddam Hussein, and therefore lost a lot of the financial support he had from the other Arab oil-rich nations. So he had two reasons for knowing that things had changed and he must negotiate. On the Israeli side, as you know, it was vital they did not come into the war, and we very successfully between us kept them out by paying a great deal of attention to their needs. But also, that was the war in which all the latest military missiles and technology was used on both sides. That was the war in which the peoples of Israel learned that they could no longer defend their property from within. The Scud missiles could be fired not from adjacent territory, but from countries further away, and still do immense damage. So it altered their whole military concept and strategy. So on their side, they knew that safety for the future lay in getting a negotiated settlement. And that is the reason, and as I watched on television that ceremony at the White House, I must say to you that I thought the speech of Prime Minister Rabin, a former soldier who'd fought for the liberty of his country, who'd lost many of his own soldiers, who'd lost the sons and daughters of his friends, I thought his speech an emotional speech, but a speech in which he'd had to come to a decision and would carry it through, was one of the great speeches of history. It really was something that one, again, could not have thought of. And so, I think we have every right to be optimistic and expectant. The very conservative theory, that is the theory, the philosophy, the belief of liberty under a rule of law, under a civic society, and under democracy, is extending the world over. Ron Reagan and I, both of us were right. Containing communism wasn't enough. We put freedom on the offensive. We went to those countries. We let them see our system. We got them over to see our system. They saw that it worked, and they knew that this century's terrible creed of communism would die before the end of the century. It's a pity it was ever born, because it was the latest form of tyranny. This century spawned the two worst tyrannies the world's ever known: Nazism with fascism in Japan, and communism. And our task now, we're getting more countries to democracy, and it's sweeping through Latin America as well, is to see that that's extended into the next century. There's an extra reason why it should be. There's no recorded example in history of one established democracy fighting another. And so it gives us very much greater security if we're able to get established democracy there. And so we can indeed be very proud of the Constitution and of the liberties which it enshrines. And we can say, very rarely do I quote from a German poet, but I quote from Goethe something which is absolutely right: that which thy fathers bequeathed thee, earn it anew if thou wouldst possess it. That is our task in this center, and one which we shall fulfill to the utmost. Thank you. Can we take, bless you, thank you very much. But I have to catch a plane, and I want to get in a lot of questions and answers first. Your questions. Thank you.
What is your view of what is happening in Bosnia and the reaction of the Western Allies up till now?
Well, the lesson of this century should have been: never appease an aggressor, or you will only encourage aggression. That was the lesson which George Bush and I had learned, and was the reason why our troops were sent to the Gulf, to stop aggression. Otherwise it would have gone through the whole of the Gulf, and there would have been no end to the damage which it would have done. When the Serbs attacked first Croatia and then Bosnia, Bosnia by that time was an independent member of the United Nations, the same principle should have applied. It was clear Serbian aggression. The Yugoslavian army is the third largest army in Europe. It is officered and mainly staffed by Serbs. They were using the whole munitions and availability of equipment of the Yugoslav army to attack the Muslims, in particular in Bosnia. Not all the Muslims. In Sarajevo itself, there have been Muslims, Croatians, and Serbs living together for a long time, and in the defense of Sarajevo, there are some Serbs on the side of the Muslims. But that's because they're Sarajevans. Otherwise, it was a clear state of aggression by Milosevic, who's always wanted, and it's always been the aim of Serbia, to get a larger Serbia. And they were trying to take territory from each of the former republics of the old Yugoslavia. We should have stopped it immediately by two means. I myself have never suggested that we put troops in on the ground. The local people know their terrain. We wouldn't know their terrain, and we would endanger troops put in on the ground to help defend. We should in fact, and I proposed it 15 months ago, have supplied the Muslims with the weapons needed to defend themselves. The right of self-defense didn't start with the United Nations Charter. It's in the United Nations Charter, but it is as old as man and doesn't depend upon the United Nations Charter. What the United Nations did, and it shows the unwisdom of relying on structures. What it did was to pass a resolution debarring any arms to be sent to the whole of the old Yugoslavia. That meant, although they recognized a right of defense, they stopped armaments going as the means of the very defense whose right they recognized. Absolutely crazy and wrong. Absolutely wrong. Thanks to the bravery of the journalists and television cameramen, we saw what was going on. We saw the concentration camps. We saw the bombing of children's playground. We saw the bombing of hospitals. We saw the terrible things that were happening. We saw a couple of Serb guerrillas holding up United Nations humanitarian aid. We knew that there are over 150,000 people who've died, and there are the 2 million people who've been driven out of their homes. Europe itself should have acted, or NATO, the countries of NATO that are in Europe, should have acted. A paralysis seemed to come over our politicians. The other thing that I suggested was that we give an ultimatum to Serbia and say, you stop the fighting in Bosnia, we'll give you 48 hours or 4 days, whichever it was. If you don't, we will use our aircraft. There were 3 aircraft carriers bobbing around in the Adriatic with aircraft on. There were tornadoes in an aerodrome in the north of Italy. We will use the tornadoes and the selective missiles in which to bomb every single military installation and supply line and bridges. And we should have followed it up. I don't understand the weakness that has come over the West. This will haunt us. This is not only the lesson that you don't appease an aggressor, we have appeased him, and there'll be other examples, but 2, the murder and massacre of the innocents should have stirred the conscience of the West, and it could have been done without putting a single soldier on the ground. It is a disgrace to Western morality. It is the time when Winston Churchill's maxim was not followed. And I fear there will be other cases of aggression either within the old Yugoslavia or elsewhere. So, well, I wish I'd been there. I'll answer the last question first. We are not protected by a written constitution or by a Supreme Court. What the Maastricht Treaty did was to transfer a lot more powers to the European community, powers in another 11 areas of government action, and made those powers subject not to a unanimous vote, but to a majority vote. That means that many new measures which affect us in the United Kingdom or other countries can be brought forward by the Commission, which is of 17 commissioners who are appointed, not elected. They can bring something forward on a simple majority to the Council of Ministers, which is minister from each of the nations, who can decide by what's called a qualified majority to accept that legislation, all this behind closed doors. That means that we, in the United Kingdom, even though our Parliament may have voted against that measure, have that law thrust upon us, and it has to be implemented in our courts, by our courts. So the consent principle, which is fundamental to democracy, goes. Now, it couldn't happen to you, I think, because of the Supreme Court. I must say to you, I never expected to see in Britain a parliament, the oldest parliament in the world, apart from a very small one in Iceland, the oldest parliament in the world, handing over its powers to a non-elected, non-accountable body, and having that body make laws which bind the United Kingdom. And we know full well that we always respect the law and put it into operation. I do not think that countries like Italy or Greece will do it in quite the same way. And it really will be very much to our disadvantage. Now, as it is, when you're going from accountability to the people, which you are when Parliament has the final say, to no accountability to the people. It is the people's rights you are giving up. In future, members of Parliament have to get up and say, I'm sorry, I'm not answerable for that. I'm no longer responsible for that. We voted to give that responsibility to the European community. But they've never had a chance to vote against that Maastricht Treaty, because all three parties officially were for it in the last election. So the people's voice has never been heard. However much they were against it, they couldn't vote against it. And one of our great constitutional writers, Dicey, who also I think will have affected some of your constitutional work, pointed out in the 8th edition of his work that where you have an election, something becomes an issue in an election, and all three parties are for the same thing, the only way to decide is a referendum. Or where you have a very important single issue, the only way to decide it is a referendum. And both of those criteria applied in this case. I think myself, actually, the people would have been against it. Some countries have had referenda, and others have not been allowed them. It's not our habit to have referenda, but when a constitutional measure of this kind happens, and we do not have the protection of a Supreme Court, but we thought we had the protection that Parliament was supreme. Parliament is not going to be supreme. It's given up that supremacy in a number of areas. That's why. Now, what did I think to the future of Europe? I think that we joined Europe, many of us. There are two views. The view which I took, and I was all for joining Europe, we joined it as a nation state willing to cooperate with other nation states in a spirit of friendship and doing together certain things, but retaining our total sovereignty. There were other people who always thought it would go more and more to full integration or a federation. We were assured it wouldn't. The history of Europe is the history of false assurances. And gradually, Europe has acquired more and more powers. And we see both the power of our law dwindling, because the European Court of Justice now is over ours. And we see our power dwindling, and we see the parliamentary power dwindling. I do not think our people like that, and I think the lesson of this century has been that groups of nations put together artificially will break up. If you look, that happened because of war. All the European empires broke up because of wartime or because each country was brought to independence. In 1945, there were 51 members of the United Nations. Now there are 184. That is the great empires breaking up. The thing this century is not only those great empires broke up, but the ideological empires have broken up. The Soviet Union. And now the diplomatic empires, Yugoslavia, 7 countries put together by the Treaty of Versailles. Totally different in history, with only one thing in common: they were the Southern Slavs. But the Serbs had always looked to Russia, the Croatians and Slavonia had always looked to Europe. Bosnia was a law unto itself. Kosovo always looked to Albania, Macedonia always towards Greece. Montenegro was absorbed into Serbia, and another one called Vojvodina consisted of many, many different nationalities. They didn't have very much in common. It was an artificial country, and that's fallen apart. And it seems quite absurd at this time for Europe to be trying to put nations together artificially. And don't forget, they have 12 different histories, 11 different languages, some only very recently democratic. Some, and 4 of them, have been fascist in my lifetime. So I think that we should go slow on Europe and have regard that people feel more secure in their own national identity, in cooperating together, which is the spirit of United Nations, the spirit of the GATT, the spirit of IMF, and the spirit of the World Bank, nations cooperating together.
National health care existed in Britain throughout your administration. We are now struggling with the question in the United States. What do you have in the way of advice for us as the way we should proceed?
Well, I think we would all agree that there must be access to medicine for those who are in need of it. The only question is how you do it. What worries me most, as far as I can see from the proposals which seem to have leaked, is that it seems to be being done by putting enormous extra burdens on business. Now, if you do that, first you're going to make it non-competitive. Alternatively, business will have no option but to cut their staff yet again, because they have to keep their total wage costs down, and that will cause other problems. We didn't put healthcare costs, health service costs on business. They do actually come on the general taxpayer. And of course, you can, in fact, have your own insurance scheme if you wish. And if an employer wishes to help towards that, he can. And it's deductible on the part of an employer for taxation purposes. We have a health service financed by the taxpayer. And it is free at the point of use. You would have to go to your own doctor. Everyone has to be on a doctor's list if you wish to avail yourself of hospital services. And the doctor these days has a budget in which he can buy the service you need, either from local hospitals or from a big London hospital if he wishes. And he will consult the patient if there's a choice of consultant as to which he should go to. We introduced that because we thought there wasn't enough choice for the person who used the health service. Inevitably, under these circumstances, you'll find that you get quite considerable waiting lists wherever there is a health service, either financed by insurance or financed in our way. You'll get waiting lists for what we call at home the cold surgery, the things for which you can wait. That is your hip replacement, your cataracts, some forms of heart operations, not all, and some forms of kidney. You will find that just the demand gets greater and greater, and this is one of the real problems. We're all going to live longer. Nearly 50% of the cost of the health service will be for people who are retired, and the longer we live, the more service, in fact, we shall require, the more attention we shall require, and the more the cost of the health service will rise. And we haven't really tackled this, nor the cost of the Social Security budget. I think our method actually is preferable because we are pretty efficient in the way in which we use our money, and we do finance the health service at 6% of gross domestic product. You are already something like 14%. We don't, of course, have the professional liability costs that you have. And that, of course, is, and you just ought to have a look at it. It is a colossal burden. My doctor friends tell me they have to take out an insurance policy of costing about $150,000 a year. It is a colossal burden. And while I'm about it, there's a second thing I think you ought to do. If we go to court or taken to court or accused of negligence and we win the case, someone take me to court, say, accusing me of negligence, and I win the case, the person who's taken me to court pays his or her costs and mine. And that's fair. You should not have to bear the burden of proving that you are not at fault or that you are innocent. You just shouldn't. Why should you be made bankrupt for that? Now, all this will help, but I must finally say that in the hospitals that I know in America, and I know quite a number, and I've done my best to help raise money for them and with them, there always is a very considerable fund to treat cases who cannot afford it. And it is the pride of the local people that they do that. But please do not pile cost upon cost upon cost on employers, and particularly small employers. Europe is busy doing that in other costs. And it will, if we're not careful, price us out of the market in many of our goods and services. I'm sorry that's a long answer, but it's a big question. Yes, I can't think what happened to some foreign ministers. There they were saying, oh, they tell me there are lots of guns and equipment in that area. They were all belonging to the Serbs. And they then said, oh, they say if we put more weapons in, there'll be more killing. And I did say, well, I'm very glad that Franklin Roosevelt didn't say that when Winston said to him, give us the tools and we'll finish the job.